So in this second part of this series on studying learning on life, I'm going to talk about the ethical considerations for doing research in these kinds of on-life contexts. So for understanding kind of the ethical considerations that you have to think about for studying learning in on-life contexts, there are kind of three main resources. The Association of Internet Researchers has been producing research ethics guidelines for this field since 2002. The latest version, the third version, was published in 2019. And these can be really understood as guidelines rather than a set of rules. In fact, the AOIR guidelines are very much a set of questions, in a sense, rather than a set of solutions. They are ways of bringing your attention to things that are relevant and questions that need to be asked when doing this kind of research. It has an orientation which can be described, because the objects of study in internet research, namely the internet and its various technologies and user groups, are both complex and ephemeral. Rules and guidelines also necessarily cannot be static. This is one of the reasons they haven't produced what could be understood as a strict set of rules. And they say that guidelines rather than a code of practice, so that ethical research can remain flexible, be responsive to diverse contexts, and be adaptable to continually changing technologies. And that's something I will talk about later here, is that need for responsiveness to changing conditions. Another really good resource is an article called Social Media Research, A Guide to Ethics by Townsend and Wallace from 2016, which includes more practical advice with examples. In terms of there being a set of rules for doing this kind of research, as you might find with some forms of medical research, for instance with research on live subjects, one of the few research councils that has actually produced a set of rules is the Norwegian Ethics Committee. And through their Social Sciences and Humanities Committee, NESH, in 2014, they produced a set of guidelines which can be understood in a more rule-like fashion. The Swedish Research Council and Etikprövningsmyndigheten, as it's called, the ethical research ethics government department, haven't really produced guidelines for research that involves the internet or online spaces in any way. So in that sense, it can be considered to be a little bit open in terms of research ethics in this space. But at the same time, there are really very important issues to be thought about. So it's important to ask the right questions and to think about the kind of ethical choices, the choices that you have to make in the design and conduct of research in online spaces. So if you look at the Norwegian Committee's guidelines, they talk about what internet research is. And they describe it as research on the internet as a phenomenon in its own right, its structure and technology. It could also be the use of the internet as a resource, as a research tool, the collection of data and information using informants, surveys, archives, logs, and algorithms, etc. That's not the same thing as studying the internet. That's using the internet. So if you use an online survey tool or online forum to have discussions with participants or to do interviews by video conference, that is research done on the internet, but it's not the same thing as researching the internet as a phenomenon, you can understand. And then there's also research on production, communication, and interaction using the internet. So that's what I'll talk about later as the traces that we leave through email, through social media, blogs, internet forums, etc. These are kind of these three different kinds of internet research. So, particularly for the kind of internet research that I'm most interested in, which is studying the the things that people do on the internet, the practices, the communication that takes place, the interactions on the internet. There are a number of research ethics challenges. And Michael Zimmer's paper, But the Data is Already Public, on the ethics of research in Facebook is a particularly good example of some of these issues. So as Zimmer describes, platforms like Facebook evoke new methodological and ethical challenges. These are, at least when he wrote this in 2010, entirely new spaces to be doing research. And at this point, more than 10 years later, these are spaces where an enormous amount of human interaction is taking place. And as Charles S. points out in 2012, general research ethics guidelines and legislation are limited in guiding internet and social media research, and that is still the case. The Norwegian Research Council is a little bit further ahead in having ethics guidelines, but in general, the research ethics regulation community hasn't really come that far, even since 2012, in regulating research on the internet. So to get back to Michael Zimmer's question, is Facebook public or private? What is the data that we leave on Facebook? Well, whether Facebook was public or private can be taken from a number of different perspectives. From a legal perspective, Facebook is in fact private. It is probably the world's largest private club. It is a members-only club that houses half the world's population. And that sounds strange because it is strange. We've never had situations where private clubs could have billions of members before. And it really raises the question about what is private and what is public. Because clearly making something available to all the members of Facebook is not particularly private. And it really depends on privacy protection in Facebook settings. So there are many ways to set your privacy, who you post to as an individual user. Groups on Facebook can have different kinds of settings. They could be open groups available to anyone to view. They could be closed groups where you have to be a member. They can be secret groups where you have to know about them. You can't search for them. So what is considered private on Facebook is a much different topic than whether or not Facebook is a members-only club. There's also the question of public access to Facebook data. So there are questions about what Facebook as a technology does and what we as researchers can access, including black boxing. And there is access to Facebook's data through what's called an API, an application programming interface. And this is a standardized way of talking to a database. An API is the way that two programs talk to each other. But as researchers, we can actually access databases from Facebook or Twitter or Stack Overflow or any number of Canvas, for that matter, any number of platforms through these APIs designed to integrate third-party software onto platforms. We can use those to extract data for our own research purposes. This changed a lot after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Before the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook's API was very open. You as a researcher could collect a great deal of data without too much trouble. After Cambridge Analytica, where a research project at Cambridge University basically extracted data on the premise of doing a research project and then shared that data with a company called Cambridge Analytica, or the Cambridge Analytica was created by the same people who had the research project, or some of the same people. And then they used that data to produce targeted election advertising, and the scandal erupted around US elections and all of that. After that, Facebook substantially restricted the amount of access that you could get through the API and made it much more difficult to get access. At the same time, other platforms like Twitter, for instance, has recently made it much easier for researchers to apply for and gain API access to their database. So what kind of access you can get and how public or private the data is to you as a researcher is different depending on the platform. And it also depends on all the kinds of, from an ethics point of view, it depends on the expectations that users have. So one could argue that data on or posts on Twitter are relatively public because for most Twitter users, they post publicly. They have an orientation to the possibility that their post can be read by millions of others when they post. On Facebook, if you post within a closed Facebook group, then you likely only have an orientation to your post being read by members of that group, not by the general public. So there are questions about what individuals understand their privacy to be that you have to understand as a researcher when you're deciding what is public and what is private. So it raises these kind of questions about, could a closed Facebook group be public? And in a project that I've had with colleagues before, we studied a Facebook group with 13,000 members. There's a question about how private can a group with 13,000 members be, in the same way how private can Facebook be with half the world's population as members. So in this case, our group was closed, but it was large and publicly oriented. It was actually a very large proportion of the professionals working in a particular field. And in interview, it was clear that members oriented to those posts in a public way, that they were making public statements in their posts. But that will, of course, be different in each context. So one of the tools I think is useful for thinking about this kind of public-private, what access to the data is reasonable from a research ethics perspective. One of the tools I think is interesting is this chart that Heidi McKee and James Porter published in 2009. And basically, it speaks to this kind of integral issue about the data that's accessible to researchers on the internet. Do we view that data as being words or images, texts, in the same sense that we might view books in a library or source documents when doing any kind of humanities research? Or do we view it as being personal interactions? Do we view it as being conversations between people? Because how we handle it from a research ethics perspective is quite different depending on that decision. So I can view the posts within a Facebook group as being just simply texts to be analyzed. In that sense, I view the internet as being a space containing these texts. I see the location, the internet, as being a medium. I see the object of study as being a published work, in a sense. And ethical rights, I would understand in terms of copyright, public access, these kind of more related to the production of works. If, on the other hand, I view the posts in that Facebook group as being interactions between people, I view the internet as a place where these interactions are taking space. I view the location as being a community or a culture, a world in a sense, a kind of anthropological or sociological view of that space. I see the object of study not as publications, as works, but as people. And I would have to consider the ethical rights of those people in terms of personal rights, person rights and community norms, these kind of things, rather than strictly the copyright or publication rights of those individuals. And there is, of course, to a certain extent, places in between those two extremes. So there are different ways to view the same data online, and they initiate completely different kind of thought processes around what the research ethics needs of that kind of research could be, even though the object of the research might be the same actual posts on the internet. And so that leads to this kind of need for a situated research ethics. That's what the guidelines that Charles S., for instance, written about in the Association of Internet Research guidelines, this kind of need for flexibility and situatedness and being reflexive in the research process, both asking questions about how you view the material and how participants view the material, for instance. So the approach that I've tended to take with my colleagues is to consider the ethical conditions, the ethical considerations of a particular project to be situated and evolving continually throughout the project, depending on what material we come in contact with, what participants. So in that sense, dependent on the contingent powers of the analytical focus, like it depends what our analytic focus is. Depends what my analytic focus is, how I consider the ethical ramifications of what I'm doing, what methodological choices I have, and what participants are involved. So the ethical decision making is, in a sense, contextual. And it's also co-produced by the platform itself, the technological platform I'm working with. So in the case of Facebook, I do have to orient to whether a Facebook group is public, closed, or secret. It isn't simply a case of trying to understand the participants' perspective while they're in the group. I also have to orient to the fact that it may be considered to be a public, like participants may act like they're in a posting in a public space in a group with a large number, but you still need to be a member and have a password or whatever it is to get into it, or a key. If it was a physical space, you would think about it as a key. And there are also gatekeepers if it's a closed group. There are moderators that are kind of part of that socio-technical system that is the platform. So the platform has rules, there are moderators, there are community norms within that platform. So all of that has to feature into the kind of situated decisions I make about how I proceed. So the kind of key considerations are, to a certain extent, the level of analysis I do. So if I'm doing a strictly text-based analysis, looking at, for instance, if I was to do a kind of corpus linguistics analysis of a social media platform, looking at the use of particular words, individual people might not be very visible in that work. They're certainly not the focus of my analytic attention. Whereas if I'm studying the way that people describe certain processes, or the way that people develop knowledge about something while participating in a particular group, then I'm interested in the trajectories of individuals. I'm interested in analyzing individual progress. Those people become the focus of the analysis, not the text products that they're making. So that makes a difference. And in the same sense, it makes a difference whether I'm looking at aggregated activity. So if I'm looking at a broad level of patterns in the activity of hundreds of users or thousands of users or millions of users, or am I looking at actions that are traceable to individual actors, to people? And very, very often when we're thinking about learning, we are interested in individuals. We're interested in things like individuals' development, which makes the individual very much the focus of our analysis, and often not at an aggregated level, looking at multiple individuals. Very often we're actually looking at single individuals. And coupled to that, a key aspect is how we think about data representation. Very often in internet research, research ethics decisions have kind of two phases. There's the ethics associated with collecting the data that you collect, and there's the ethics associated with the publishing of data. And one of the reasons for that is that it's very, very, very hard to anonymize anyone once you start quoting them directly or using the products they leave on platforms. Any kind of text becomes searchable immediately. So you constantly have to weigh anonymity versus kind of the integrity. So can you really promise anonymity, for instance, when you recruit participants to a study? No, you probably can't in many cases. You can if you're not going to publish text or other forms of information that might be traceable back to them, but things are very, very traceable once they're online. And we have, just like we have as researchers, really a lot of opportunities to use computational technologies to sort through huge amounts of data and to search for things. Other people do too. So other people can take the things we found and then backtrace where we found them from. So that's something we really need to think about when we're making decisions about what we publish and how. So in my own studies, it's very often that there is a different consent for collecting data than if I want to publish something that's traceable to someone. So I will actually collect consent to collect, in some cases, data, and then go back for a different consent for actually publishing something from an individual that would reveal them online if someone went to the trouble of trying to search for them. And of course, in some cases, it isn't possible to collect consent at all. So if you're dealing with thousands and thousands of users, it's impractical to get consent. So decisions have to be made about whether it's acceptable to collect people's interactions and do analysis on them without revealing them because of the scale of a project, of a group or of a community. This all comes down to whether the orientation is public or private as well. Something like 80% of all the internet research done is on Twitter. And the reason for that is that Twitter is relatively easy to access. And also from a research ethics point of view, people make the argument that tweets are made publicly to the world and are therefore accessible to researchers. And it's ethically, you can argue that it's ethical to use those tweets and even republish them without consent. There are issues, though, with that judgment because it may not be that simple. People may not actually have that orientation when they post their tweets. And also when you use somebody's words or somebody's interactions in research, you use them for a purpose that they were never intended for in the first place. So there is a balance to be had there. And it's the classical balance of reward versus risk. So in all research, a decision has to be made about whether the reward from doing the research is worth the risk and the bother to people of doing it. So that is the same with internet research as it is with any other kind of research. So it's this issue that data is often public, yet often also personal. Informed consent is hard to request, and an argument has to be made for why it's not being collected if it's not going to be collected. And that has to be well thought out. And there are challenges to estimating a participant's intentions and awareness when they post online. And this is doubly so if the group is vulnerable in any way. So, or if what they're posting can lead to vulnerabilities, either within that online community that they're part of, or related to their workplace, or in a way that it reveals their location. There are all kinds of ways that revealing somebody's online activity might render them more vulnerable. So that needs to be thought of. And of course, this issue of anonymization that many people seem to think is quite easy to deal with, that it's very easy to anonymize people, but the truth is that it is actually very difficult to anonymize people because information is so searchable online and because it's so easy to connect data. So even when you think you've hidden someone, it may be actually relatively easy to connect 2 or 3 data points you have in your study to then reveal them again, for instance. So that's, again, that question of what level are you working at? Are you working at a personal individual level? Are you working with texts? Are you working at an aggregated level with lots of people's data is represented together in the analysis process, or where individuals are truly visible in it? So all of these issues need to be thought about and arguments need to be made. And there are not hard and fast rules to it, but what's important is that the researcher takes a reflexive and sort of situated perspective on this to try to formulate arguments that make sense for the research that they're doing.